Great Lakes Cormorants, GLC, celebrates the presence of cormorants, pelicans, gannets, loons, and other fish-eating birds in our environment, and acknowledges the roles these birds play as a natural part of the ecosystems they inhabit. GLC is dedicated to educating the public, promoting science, dispelling misinformation and myths about cormorants, and advocating for the protection of cormorants and other fish-eating birds. Bad reputations, cormorants and conservation with Gail Fraser, PhD. This talk took place on March 11th, 2021 in Toronto, Canada. Gail Fraser from York University's Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change describes the role of cormorants in the Great Lakes ecosystems and why she opposes the province-wide hunt in Ontario, Canada as a tool to manage cormorants. Her research examines issues around the ecology and management of avian wildlife with a focus on colonial nesting waterbirds. She has studied double-crested cormorants for more than 14 years at Tommy Thompson Park in Toronto, Ontario. York University Land Acknowledgement. We recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. The university acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Wendat, and the Métis. It is now home to many Indigenous peoples. York University acknowledges the current treaty holders and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region.
Hi, I'm Gail Fraser, and I'm going to talk to you about double-crested cormorants. Double-crested cormorants are a charged topic right now because of a recent province-wide hunt that was implemented in September of 2020. So in this webinar, I'm going to give you some background on the species, its ecology in the Great Lakes ecosystem, and why I think a hunt is not the way to be managing this species. So cormorants are an aquatic fish-eating predator. They are native to North America. They are migratory. So double-crested cormorants that come to Ontario spend much of the winter in around the Gulf of Mexico region. And Ontario is our stewards to the largest subpopulation of double-crested cormorants in North America. That's the interior population that breeds on the Great Lakes. So when cormorants do arrive to the breeding grounds, which is soon, so it's going to be in March next week sometime, the males, well, likely the males, because this hasn't been fully verified, but they do this super goofy display, which I have a photograph of a bird doing it here, and I liken it to a cormorant imitating a turkey. So they throw up their head and they throw up their tail, and they do this wing waving display. So they're pumping their wings in and out, and then they're doing this hooting call, which is deep and low, so it carries for a long distance. And essentially, it's a cormorant advertising that it's available and looking for a mate. So cormorants have a flexibility. They will nest on the ground. It's on the left-hand side here on the image, and in trees, but they are what's called colonial nesting waterbirds. So they nest in colonies and groups. So you will almost never see a cormorant doing its solo, nesting solo somewhere. So they like to be with other conspecifics is what we call them. And unlike ducks and geese, it takes both parents to successfully raise young. So both parents, you cannot tell a male from a female unless you get them in the hand and get a blood sample. So they're monomorphic. And the chicks are what's called altricial. So if you think of a robin chick, they're little, naked, totally vulnerable. And you can see in the background of this photograph, the parent is feeding their little chick. So unlike ducks and geese, the chicks require a lot of care and attendance by the parent, by one parent at least, throughout the breeding season at the nest while the other one is out foraging. So cormorants, from banding studies, we know that they have delayed reproduction. So they have a sub-adult phase, and this is what the bird on the left is showing. So they won't start breeding till they're 2 or 3 years old. And then once they are considered to be an adult, they have a mean life expectancy of 6 years old, although there have been some cormorants that have lived as long as 18 years. So the bottleneck in survivorship for this population is really the young of the year. So those are chicks that are just leaving the nest, and they have a high mortality rate, which is very common in these types of birds, where they're just, there's a lot of mortality between being a fledged chick and being a sub-adult and coming into adulthood. And the sub-adults do something which I think is so cool. It's been demonstrated for great cormorants. We need more work on it for double-crested cormorants, but they are almost certainly likely doing something called prospecting, where they will come up. So they're not breeding, but they will come up and check out different colonies and be making future decisions about where they would want to breed. So this is a condensed timeline of cormorants in North America, just starting around the turn of the 20th century. So at the turn of the 20th century was a dire time for many large visible birds, because there was unregulated hunting. And there was a millinery trade that was driving a lot of birds being killed for feathers and hats. And so at the turn of the 20th century, most large visible water birds were at an all-time low. And that was also true for cormorants. And then cormorants started to recover, specifically in Ontario, and there was some unsanctioned control, i.e. people just went out and killed them. That was not permissible. And then in the 60s and 70s, there were pollutants, DDT, DDE, PCBs. Cormorants are top predators, so they were also affected, negatively affected by those pollutants, these persistent organic pollutants, and resulting in a huge decline in the Great Lakes population that was already a pretty low number. And I'm going to give you some specific numbers in the next slide. So because of this all-time low, there was protection that was implemented in the US. They were added to the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. They were not added in Canada. Some states listed double-crested cormorants as a species at risk, and there were pollution control measures. So we stopped putting out so much DDT and PCBs. And so the population started to recover. And at the same time, there was this invasive fish species, which I'll show you a photograph of in a little while, called alewife, which also populations were booming in the Great Lakes, and that helped support the recovery of double-crested cormorants. So here are some numbers. And so these are nest estimates for the Great Lakes between 1950 and 2005. And you can see that in 1950, there was just a little under 1,000 nests, and that's where there were these unsanctioned controls. It dropped in 1972 to an all-time low of 135 nests. So you would have been very hard pressed to see a cormorant in the Great Lakes during this time period. And then there were these control measures and reduction of pollutants. And so the population started to recover, and it started to recover in a fairly rapid way, which in ecology we would call exponential growth. So it's really going up a steep curve. And I can see it's blocked, the number is blocked off here, but the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry is estimating around 71,000 nests in Ontario. And that is an estimate. And because each nest requires 2 adults, you would double that number to get a breeding adult population estimate for Ontario. So this rapid recovery of double-crested cormorants on the Great Lakes is a conservation success story, and that is how Environment Canada framed it when they called it was winning the war against contaminants. So the fact that we have a recovered double-crested cormorant population on the Great Lakes is really indicative of how well we've done in trying to have a clean, healthy set of lakes. But because of this rapid rise, the species went from being virtually extirpated to now being abundant. Some people think they're invasive. There's a whole generation of people in Ontario who never saw cormorants because they were at an all-time low. So they think that all of a sudden this highly abundant bird somehow doesn't belong in this region. But this recovery has come at a cost, and it's for human-wildlife conflict, and this species is now likened to rats and locusts. So what are the conflicts? The two main ones that I'm going to consider in this talk are fish, and that is sport fisheries, which is shown here, or commercial fisheries, but also aquaculture production. The second one is that cormorants, they nest in colonies, as I mentioned. They also nest in trees, but when they nest in trees, they have high nest densities. So there's lots of nests in one particular tree, and their guano, or their poop, falls onto the soil, and it alters the soil, it acidifies the soil, and essentially causes tree mortality. And that happens quite rapidly, and I'll show you a photograph later on. And this is quite disturbing to people. So they think somehow this ecological change is wrong. And that's another reason why there is this cormorant wildlife cormorant human conflict. So because of the rapid rise of cormorants, there has been a great deal of research and on how to best manage this species. So this is a quote from Linda Wires, who has spent a great deal of time critiquing cormorant management. And so it's essentially just defining what cormorant management is: to reduce cormorant numbers or cormorant predation, that's fish predation, at a variety of spatial and temporal scales. And it may utilize lethal or non-lethal techniques. So let's get to a fun one for non-lethal deterrence. So we're trying to have cormorants not nest in a particular area. This is in the Hamilton Harbor in Ontario, and there's several islands, some of which cormorants were nesting on, some of which herring gulls were nesting on. Anyway, so cormorants started taking all of these nesting spaces, and the managers of these islands wanted herring gulls to have a space to nest. And so they put up this dancing Santa. So it's one of these automated dancing Santas, and it completely freaked out the cormorants. So the cormorants did not nest on this island, but the herring gulls are super smart, and they totally knew what was going on and that the dancing Santa wasn't a threat, and successfully nested on this island. So it took 4 years for the cormorants to catch on that the dancing Santa wasn't a threat. So that's an example of non-lethal deterrence. Another example of management falls somewhere between non-lethal and lethal, and that is called egg oiling. So if you, right after birds, ground nesting birds, it only works on ground nesting birds, right after they lay eggs, it's fresh eggs, it's like if you're eating a chicken egg. If you oil the eggs, it essentially prevents the embryo from developing. And that essentially means the parents are going to sit there until they realize that the eggs aren't going to hatch. And so as a management technique, it's indirect. So remember that I said that there's this delayed reproduction for cormorants. So they have a couple of years where they're subadults. So if you reduce what in ecology is called recruitment, so if you're recruited into the population, you've become a breeder. If you reduce the recruitment, so by reducing the number of chicks that have hatched that year, there's a delayed effect, right? So it's not going to happen for 2 or 3 years. So nest failure means lower numbers and the young of the year that are available to be recruited into the population. And then the main management technique that has been applied, egg oiling has been applied a lot of places, but another one is culling or killing of birds. So I created this map. The stars are aquaculture sites that had the first permits to kill cormorants. So cormorants breeding, the interior Great Lakes population is breeding and then migrating down the Mississippi Flyway and hanging out around the Gulf of Mexico. And the southern United States had put huge aquaculture farms right in the middle of those flyway paths, and it looked very attractive to cormorants. So, so aquaculture applied for permits, and then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service approved this public resource depredation order, and it was now just reapproved, where the states with handguns can kill cormorants without too much difficulty. And there's an estimate by Linda Wires between 1998 and 2012 of 300,000 cormorants have been culled, but it's past 500,000 now. And in Canada, there have been 3 sites prior to Ontario's hunt, which I will talk about, where specific cull occurred in Alberta, which is over fisheries, in Ontario, Middle Island, which was about habitat, and also in Quebec, which was also about habitat. So Brian Dorr et al., Guillaume et al. I did a whole bunch of modeling. This is a very complicated paper, but essentially concluded that if you want a strong, if your goal in management is to drop the cormorant population, you get a strongest response when you combine culling with egg oiling. So now I'm going to spend the last part of this webinar on the Ontario cormorant cull. So this was an announcement that was made on a Friday of a long weekend, which is always a clue. If the government wants to bury something, that's when they make an announcement. So it was made on the Friday of a long weekend of July 31st, 2020, that there would be a cormorant hunt in Ontario, and that it would be 15 birds per day. It's after the breeding season, which was good because the first proposal had it across the breeding season, and of 106 days in the fall. And a key piece of this is that game wastage was permitted. And that was a change that was made on the Ontario Fish and Wildlife Act to permit game wastage. Prior to this, if you were a hunter and you killed something, you had to take it home and eat it or consume it in some fashion. So a game wastage was added to the Ontario Fish and Wildlife Act, which permits hunters, they still have to dispose of the body of cormorant carcasses appropriately, but they do not have to eat it. And so this is really a fundamental change in how we think about hunting and the outcomes of hunting. So I have at the top is quotes from the Ministry of Natural Resources in Ontario, Yakubuski. And I'm just pulling out a quote at the top, and then what the problem is from my perspective as a wildlife biologist. So the minister says that they will continue to monitor the cormorant population status and trends to support sustainability of cormorants in the province. A fundamental approach to wildlife management is identifying desired population sizes. So if we were going to apply this metric to double-crested cormorants, a migratory colonial nesting water bird species, it would mean identifying the desired number and location of colonies or population densities for regions, for example. Yet, when this cull, which was called a hunt, was announced, it had 2 pages, and there were 3 metrics. It was the estimated number of breeding adults in Ontario, the daily bag limit and the number of days of the hunt. So there were no population sizes, there are no objectives. So how they can decide what is a sustainable cormorant population in Ontario remains a mystery. I should say that in an estimate in Ontario that there's 146,000 people who have a small game license. And even if only 7% of those people undertook some kind of cormorant hunt, not for the whole time limit, but only for 10 days, and they got the bag limit. So 7%, they got the bag limit of 15 birds a day, and they went out hunting for 10 days. That exceeds the total number of breeding adults in Ontario. So that is clearly a problem. The Ministry of Natural Resources in Ontario in 2006 stated that they, in any future management, they would consider relevant science in the management of cormorants. And they had a pretty thorough report in 2006. And at the time, in 2006, they said, let's just manage the population. It doesn't seem like there's much of an issue. So in this 2-page announcement about a hunt, there was no evaluation on why a province-wide hunt was the preferred management option. And this is in huge contrast to the United States, which undertook a very significant environmental impact assessment, where they evaluated each different type of management option, management tool, and that's how they landed on the depredation resource permit approach. And in fact, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife specifically rejected hunting as an option of controlling management of controlling cormorants. You will get a sense of, when I go through this talk, that there is a huge body of literature on cormorant management from a wildlife science perspective, and both for double-crested cormorants, but also for great cormorants, which have equivalent conflicts in Europe. And so to have a 2-page document that announces a significant hunt, which could remove some unknown piece of the cormorant population in Ontario, is a problem. The minister says that there's concerns about local ecosystems, that cormorants are eating fish. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this particular issue. So I'm going to start off with talking about Zone 18 in Eastern Ontario. Zone 18 in Eastern Ontario is a hotspot of cormorant conflict. And there was a process that went on a couple of years ago. It was a fisheries biologist from the academics and from the community, fishing from the community, and also from the MNR. There was this 141-page report on fisheries management for Eastern Ontario in Zone 18. And the word cormorant did not show up in it. And so the main things about how to best protect and manage fisheries were issues around climate change and invasive species. And so, as of 2 or 3 years ago, the Ministry of Natural Resources did not think that cormorants were actually a problem in the management and maintaining healthy fisheries in Eastern Ontario. The quote by the minister talks about impacts to local ecosystems. And that is a very key phrase, which is why I bolded it, because if there are impacts to fisheries by cormorants, cormorant predation, there is very much geographic specificities. So what I'm going to do is just walk you through the data that you would need to demonstrate that cormorants actually have an effect on a particular fish population. So on the left-hand side is the first question that you would need to address. So does a particular fish species show up in the cormorant diet? So you would want to know, well, how much does it show up? What's the size of the fish that shows up? also related to size is what's the age of the fish species being consumed. Is it pre-breeding, like the fish breeding, non-breeding? And then there's a whole bunch of different methods that can be used to get at these data. For example, when you handle chicks, when you're banding them, they often vomit up fish. So that's one way to get fish species. And then another one is for birds that are being culled, you can look at their fish stomachs. So each one of those has error associated with these metrics. So that's the cormorant side. So now let's look at the fishery side. Linda Wires, and this is all from Wires et al., which is a workshop that came from great cormorant researchers in Europe and North American researchers, cormorant researchers in a workshop asking this very question. What are the best assessments to determining cormorant impact to fish populations? So the first issue is, what is the definition of an impact? So is it that the fishing community cannot catch as many fish? So is it the catch rate? Is it that you're saying the total numbers of the fish species is declining, so it's an abundance metrics? Is it an economic factor? Is it the community that is supporting recreational fishing has a decline in economics, or of course a commercial economic decline? So the definition of an impact is often not provided when people are complaining about cormorant impacts to fisheries. Then there are, it's not just a two species system in these aquatic ecosystems. You have multiple predators. You have pollution, which I've already identified some historical issues with pollution. And there's also competition around the target fish population that might be of interest of. You would need to know if, for example, that you want to, the definition of your impact is abundance, and you're saying that cormorants are making yellow perch populations decline. You would want to know, how are those fish population trends being measured? And like the diet piece on the left-hand side, there are also errors involved. And so what are the methods? What are the problems with those methods? How are they being measured? And then, of course, there's dynamics in fish populations. There's abiotic, water temperature, ice cover, oxygen levels that can affect recruitment of fish into the breeding population that have nothing to do with double-crested cormorant predation. And then finally, and this is to the broader point of geographic specificity, is that these studies, you need to define the spatial scales. So if you're saying double-crested cormorants have an impact on a fishery, what's the scale? Is it Big Rideau Lake? Is it Eastern Lake Ontario? So you have to draw some boundaries around that to ask those questions. This is a simplified aquatic food web for Lake Ontario, in which I added double-crested cormorants on the right-hand side. So the people that are fishing tend to go for the species that are at the top of this food web: lake trout, Chinook salmon, coho salmon. I've already mentioned briefly alewife. So this was an invasive forage fish species. It's forage because it's supporting these top predators. It's also supporting double-crested cormorants. And round goby, which is also an invasive fish. So both alewife and round goby compete with native fish species. And I also mentioned in the 70s, there was these population booms of alewife, and they were so dramatic. And the beaches they'd be these huge die-offs, and the beaches and across Lake Ontario would be littered with alewife. That the management strategy, remember there were almost no cormorants at that time. The management strategy was to introduce non-native predators like coho salmon, which are now a very important sport fishery. So cormorants, where I study them, which is in Tommy Thompson Park and in the Toronto Harbor, are primarily feeding their chicks alewife. and a little bit around goby and a little bit of other things, but it was like almost 95% alewife every time I look at that. So the interactions between cormorants and their prey populations are localized in space and time. And the results from one study, say, for example, there was a study that showed that there was a significant effect on yellow perch abundance in Lake Champlain. You can't take those data and apply it to Georgian Bay. You need to have the data from the area that is of concern. So if there's a conflict, if there's a perceived conflict that cormorants are having a negative impact, however that's defined, on a fish population, it has to be, you have to get the data for that particular region. You can't take some data over here and go, it applies over here, because each lake, each system has a different assemblage of predators. It has different abiotic factors that are affecting fish abundance, et cetera. So it's very important to understand that there is geographic specificity in predator-prey interactions. So there was a province-wide hunt that took place in September of 2020 to December of 2020. And there was no reporting required. So none of the people that went out and killed cormorants were required to report how many cormorants were killed. There's this geographic specificity around cormorant prey fisheries interactions. And we don't know how many cormorants were killed. And so a province-wide hunt or cull will not permit any assessment of how cormorants may impact a particular fishery. Zero. This is a map of the birds of, it's from the Birds of North America. And it has the breeding populations, the different populations, the migratory populations. So I'm showing you this here for a reason. So cormorants are migratory. So they spend their summers breeding in shared waters along the Great Lakes, which we share with the US, but many cormorants are breeding in Canada. And then they're going to go to the United States, where they're going to be also managed, at least in the management, even though there are significant critiques about the cormorant management in the US, at least the US knows approximately how many birds are being killed every year. Ontario, on the other hand, will not be able to coordinate with the US Fish and Wildlife Service about managing this migratory species, because we do not know how many birds are going to be killed or have been killed in this hunt. There was a concern in the 2-page announcement of a province-wide hunt of double-crested cormorants that they damage trees where they nest and roost. So let's put this in context first for those of you that are not living in Southern Ontario. The context in Southern Ontario is that the primary driver of endangerment to wildlife in Southern Ontario is agriculture. So it's transforming natural habitats to agriculture. That's the primary endangerment to wildlife. Cormorants are considered to be ecosystem engineers, and I put this quote up here by Jones et al., who defined ecosystem engineers. So these are organisms that they're modifying or indirectly modifying resources that affect other species by causing a physical state of change or abiotic materials. So beavers are another good example of an ecosystem engineer. But in doing so, they modify, maintain, and create habitat. So this is two contrasting images. This is the forest that I started working in at Tommy Thompson Park in the Toronto Harbor, and this is probably taken in 2006. And this is what it looks like more or less now, although I think some of these trees are actually down. So it's turned from a forest into a field. This is not habitat loss. This is habitat modification. Habitat loss is taking a forest and turning it into a parking lot or highway. The minister said that they will monitor double-crested cormorants. I'm sorry, I'm jumping one ahead. So this is still on the habitat issue. So they said there's this impact on local habitats. The problem in Ontario is that there was already a management tool for private landowners to address this issue. So if a landowner had double-crested cormorants started nesting on their property, there was already a permit and therefore management tool in place. And we did not need a province-wide call to address this particular issue. So the minister says that they will continue to monitor the cormorant population in Ontario. So they don't define, I've already said this, they didn't define what a sustainable cormorant population is. And of course, in ecology, there's lots of modeling tools that you can use to understand if you take 10% of a breeding population, what that will result in the future, but that was not done. And I'm going to do 2 points here. One is that there was a study in Europe that was done on great cormorants. And they had, because there was hunting that's going on great cormorants in Europe. So they did an experimental hunt. And in that experimental hunt, they found that, so this is scientifically designed to compare 2 different areas where hunting occurred. They found that the young of the year, so this is a fledgling double-crested cormorant, but this is great cormorants, was a study. The young of the year were the birds that were almost entirely killed in the experimental hunt in Europe. So you have that piece. The second piece is that, remember I said that there's delayed reproduction in these birds. So you have a population of sub-adults that can just move into being breeders. And so even if you do kill a significant number of breeders, that sub-adult population is going to move in, and it's called compensatory recruitment. So it could be several years if this hunt continues before we actually understand how many birds were killed. So monitoring breeding adults at colonies, while very important, in fact, is not the metric that we need to be using to understand how many birds were killed. So between the young of the year likely being the most number of birds being killed and sub-adults moving into breeding adults, we could have, you could kill tens of thousands of cormorants and not know it for several years. The Wildlife Society of North America has adopted 7 principles for wildlife conservation. This hunt, this province-wide hunt or call, departs from 2 of those 7, one of which I've already mentioned, in that there's game wastage that's permitted. So wildlife should only be killed for legitimate, non-frivolous purposes. And I believe that the Ontario government has not laid out fully what the issues are for this using a science-based approach, which is the second issue in this model. So Aldo Leopold in 1933 said that we should be using science as the management tool for wildlife conservation. So people have known for over 80 years that sciences should be used to manage wildlife populations. So this announcement and this hunt and call that has occurred in Ontario has, in fact, departed from the conservation of wildlife principles in North America. Aldo Leopold, when he first started his work, thought that predators were bad, and he supported the culling of wolves and coyotes and bears. But then he saw what the effects were when you remove apex predators from those systems. And it's really only recently that researchers are turning to aquatic ecosystems to understand and try and understand what it means when you remove apex predators from aquatic ecosystems. Cormorants are an apex predator in an aquatic ecosystem. And this paper here is a really good review on ecosystem function and the ecosystem services that are provided by aquatic predators. And I'll just read the quote that aquatic predators can influence food webs through their consumptive effects. Associated prey reductions in prey populations can initiate trophic cascades within and across ecosystems. So the presence of top predators can very much influence the structure of food webs in aquatic ecosystems. And we need to understand substantially more how cormorants fit into these ecosystem frameworks. So to conclude, I think it's clear that I would be asking for a responsible evidence-based management of double-crested cormorants in Ontario. We could be focusing on areas of high conflict, where there's high conflict between humans and cormorants. And within those areas, there would be solid data on cormorant populations, what the population goals would be for various take levels. So if you remove 10% of a cormorant population, what would that mean for that particular area? That would come with rationales and objectives, and when it would be reevaluated, how much of the population would be taken. And by doing so, this would allow us to coordinate the management of double-crested cormorants, a migratory bird species, with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And together we could understand that we're not completely damaging this species. So I'd like to thank you for watching this webinar. And there's a whole bunch of people that I would like to thank, which I've listed here.